Then they set about examining their wounds and treating them with their folk remedies. This went on all night, which was not so long at that time of year. In the morning, they began to discuss where to go next. After lengthy debates, they finally decided to conquer Pyrrhont and then other rich cities. They obtained information about everything from fugitives who knew not only what was in the cities, but even in every house. According to this decision, which was recognized as promising benefits, they slowly moved forward, encountering no resistance, and looted and burned along the way. The army, besieged in Adrianople, learned from reliable intelligence sources that the Goths had left and that the surrounding area had been freed from the enemy. At midnight, they left the city and set off along detour roads and surrounding paths, some toward Philippopolis, and from there to Serdica, others to Macedonia. Gathering all their forces and weapons, they set off at the fastest possible pace, hoping to find Valens somewhere in those parts. They were completely unaware that he had perished in the heat of battle, or more precisely, that he had fled to the wooden hut, as they say, and died in the fire. The brave Huns and Alans, seasoned in battle, joined the Goths. Fritigern gained these allies by luring them with enormous spoils. Having set up camp near Pyrrhont, in view of their recent losses, they did not dare to approach the city, nor to storm it. But instead, they completely plundered the vast fertile area around the city, killing or capturing the rural population. From there, they marched quickly to Constantinople, whose incalculable treasures aroused their predatory instincts. Fearing ambushes, they advanced in formation with the intention of using all their forces to destroy the glorious people. But when they boldly rushed out of the city and almost pulled the locks off the gates, the heavenly god drove them away with the following accident. Shortly before that, a detachment of Saracens had arrived in Constantinople, more suited to plunder than to systematic combat. Seeing the barbarians, the Saracens suddenly stormed them outside the city to measure their strength against them. The battle was prolonged and fierce, and both sides dispersed without any outcome. But the Easterners' squad won with a new and never-before-seen tactic. One of them, with thick hair, naked to the waist, letting out hoarse, scary screams, threw himself into the middle of the Goths with a dagger in his hand. After killing one, he bit into his throat and began to drink the gushing blood. This monstrous scene struck such terror into the barbarians that they retreated before attempting anything else, not with their savage courage, but with obvious fear. Gradually, their resolve weakened after they surveyed the enormous length of the walls, the widely scattered neighborhoods of buildings, the inaccessible beauties of the city, the countless number of inhabitants, and the strait around the city that connects it to Pontus and the Aegean. Having thrown away the equipment they had prepared for siege engines, after suffering more losses than they had inflicted, they withdrew from here and headed for the northern provinces. They reached the very foot of the Julian Alps, which in ancient times were called the Venetian Alps. Pointinger's map, the most famous geographical illustration from antiquity of Europe, the Near and Middle East, and North Africa, is the so-called Pointinger's or Pevdinger's map, a document read in Latin. It is a typical travel guide itinerarium prepared and used in ancient Rome, which has not come down to us in its original form, but through a copy based on several similar ancient documents from the 1st to the 5th century AD, as can be seen from the geographical names on the map. The copy was drawn in 1265 by an unknown monk from Colmar, a town in Alsace, taken from the South German monastery by the German Renaissance poet and historian Conrad Celtis, who in 1508 bequeathed it to the Augsburg city secretary Conrad Poiting, after whom it is named. The Poitinger map was first published in 1598 by Marcus Welser. In 1720, it became the property of Prince Eugene of Savoy. After his death, his entire personal library was inherited by the Habsburg court. Today, it is kept in the Austrian National Library Hofburg in Vienna. The Poitinger map is a parchment scroll 0.34 m wide and 6.75 m long, assembled from 11 sections. The map is colorful, resembling an elongated quadrangle with distorted proportions, curved from west to east, schematic in description and cognitive. The map is not a description of the world, but a description of the road network with distances and transport routes. The roads are drawn so that all inscriptions and images can be clearly read. The actual proportions or geographical directions are not taken into account. The inscriptions are in Latin. They are in Gothic style, characteristic of German monasteries. Large cities are marked with icons, and the more significant the city, the richer the icon. Rome, Constantinople, and Antioch are depicted with the thrones of their rulers, most likely the sons of Constantine, which indicates their great importance in the respective centuries. It is interesting that special attention is paid to settlements with hot mineral springs, and directions are given to places for balneotherapy. It is interesting to note that special attention is paid to settlements with hot mineral springs, and directions are given to places for balneotherapy. Small towns are marked only with text. Distances are written in Roman miles, 1,480 miles, or Gallic leagues, 2,220 miles, if they are west of Lyon. The map also shows the peoples and tribes inhabiting the respective geographical areas in the 1st centuries AD, which is of great interest to us. Somewhere there are even additions and characteristic definitions for some peoples. It can be seen that the river Ister, Danube, is drawn in the upper part of the map for the areas of Europe that are considered the northern border of the Roman Empire, and only in a few places are there roads heading north. Many place names, names of tribes and settlements, are either misplaced or misspelled according to established tradition and numerous other written sources. Therefore, the designations on this map often have to be taken as approximate, or simply explained according to the correct geographical directions and names. The modern point of view is too reserved, and it should be generously acknowledged that the error is correct. Let us begin our observation of the designations of the tribes and settlements north of the Danube River, from its mouth in an east-west direction, bounded on the northeast by the Agalagus River, located in segment 8 of the map. The tribes are the Veneti, Dacians, Geti, and Piti. The Agalagus River, which appears to be located where the Prut River is today, originates in the Alps of the Bastarni, most likely the Carpathians. South of this mountain range to the Danube River, no tribes are marked. It is assumed that these lands are undoubtedly inhabited by the Thracians, whose region and province of Thrace is marked in bold font, bordering Dalmatia to the west, Lower Moesia to the north, and Macedonia to the south. Northeast of the Alps, the tribes of the Dacians and Bastarni are marked, which continue their spread even further west and north of the Carpathians. West of these and north of the Danube lie the Veneti Sarmatians. In segment VH, west of them are the Lupione Sarmatians, extending north of the settlement of Pannonia. To the west of these were the Amichobii Sarmatians. To the south of the Danube in this region was the province of Lower Moesia. To the west of these were the Salagadines Sarmatians, and to the south of them and the Danube was the province of Upper Moesia with its capital Singidunum, i.e. Singidunum. From there on the left bank of the Danube, i.e. to the north according to the true directions, there are again Sarmatian Lagii or Vagi. To the southwest of these lands, on the right bank of the Danube, are Lower Pannonia and further to the northwest, Upper Pannonia. Generally speaking, according to Pevtindra's map, the left bank of the Danube is inhabited entirely by various tribes of the Sarmatians, while on the right bank of the river, from the regions of Upper Pannonia to the Danube Delta, the lands and Roman provinces from the time of Emperor Marcus Aurelius are marked. To the east of the Danube Delta are depicted, one after the other, the rivers Sorso-Euphrates and Selianis. The initial letters of the word are blurred, the latter two flowing into each other. The lands to the east of it are inhabited by the Roxolani and Sarmatians. The Soripes River follows. East of it, up to Lake Meotis, the lands are inhabited by the Meoti tribes. Next to the river are inscriptions in red letters, Tanasis and Galati, which I assume refer to tribes, and the river is described as the Tanais River, which separates Asia from Europe. North of it, in black letters, are the Maharati tribes, and in red letters, the Sorika tribes. Southeast of the Tanais River are the Soreko and Sardis rivers. Between them, from northwest to southeast, are the tribes of the Kannada, Sakani, and Alani, who live north of a mountain, probably the Caucasus Mountains. South of the Sardis River lives the Aspergiani tribe. To the south is a lake or marsh into which the Ilmerb River flows, continuing after the lake until it flows into Lake Meotis, and south of it are the Laz and Eniochi tribes. On the right bank of the Danube, in the lands from the Black Sea to the west through Thrace, Mysia, Dalmatia, and from there south to Macedonia, the toponymy is clearer and more accurate and corresponds to the historiographical tradition. The annoying impression is made by the incorrect spelling of Philippopolis as Phimmopopolis, which confirms the low assessment of the author as a geographer or copyist. It is evident that the toponyms on Poitindera's map are quite distorted from the commonly known ones, are not clearly legible, and raise many questions about their reliability. The most characteristic feature we notice in Poitindera's map is that the lands along almost the entire left bank of the Danube, from Pannonia to the regions north of Lake Meotis, are inhabited by a group of Sarmatian tribes. They differ in some of their characteristics, mainly in terms of quality or geographical location, but they are all Sarmatians. These are the first centuries AD, and the data comes not from chroniclers or historians, but from geographers and traveling merchants. This is probably why they have their shortcomings in terms of toponyms in traditional historiography, but on the other hand, they may be more authentic and closer to the truth. The question needs to be resolved through additional in-depth research and comparative linguistics. The presence of several Sarmatian tribes according to Poitindera's map determines their significant place as a homogeneous ethnic saturation in those times in the lands of present-day Hungary, Austria, Slovakia, Vojvodina, Romania, Moldova, Ukraine, and Russia, and raises a big question mark as to who they are related to and what their significance is in the ethnic definition of the peoples of that era and the centuries that followed. According to Bulgarian chronicles, the Sarmatians are Bulgarian tribes from the Sarmatian dynasty. 2 to 10. Prisk, the Thracian Prisk, came from the Thracian city of Panion, which is why he was also called Prisk of Panion. What we know about him comes from his own works. He was an assistant in the missions of the Roman diplomat Maximin. As such, he visited the Hun Bulgarian Emperor Attila in 448 in Pannonia and in his Byzantine history, the first part of which is titled Tatian History. He provides detailed descriptions of Attila himself, describing his observations of his life and lifestyle. Fragments. Gothic history. When Rua ruled over the Huns, he decided to wage war against the Emilzers, the Itamars, the Tonosers, and the armies and other peoples who had settled around the Danube and were under the protection of the Romans. He sent Islas, who usually served him in his disputes with the Romans, to tell them that he would break the peace previously concluded if they did not hand over to him all those who had fled to them. Then the Romans decided to send an embassy to the Huns. Plint and Dionysius wanted to go as envoys. Plint was a Scythian, and Dionysius was a Thracian by nationality. Both were military commanders and had already been appointed consuls in the Roman Empire. Since it seemed likely that Islas would overtake the embassy sent to Rua, Plint sent his trusted man, Singila, with him to convince Rua to negotiate with him rather than with the other Romans. When Rua died and royal power over the Huns was given to Attila and Bleda, the Roman Senate decided to send Plint as an envoy. After this proposal was confirmed by the emperor, Plintus wished to be accompanied in the delegation by Epigenes, who enjoyed great fame both for his wisdom and for being a quaestor. When his choice was confirmed, the two set off as envoys and arrived in the city of Margos. This was a city of the Moesians in Illyria, located on the river Ister opposite the fortress of Constantius, which was on the opposite bank. The royal Scythians had also arrived there. They met outside the city, mounted on their horses. The barbarians did not have the custom of dismounting when negotiating. Therefore, the Roman envoys, preserving their dignity, appeared before the Scythians in the same manner, so as not to negotiate as horsemen and foot soldiers. It was decided that in the future, the Romans would not only refuse to accept fugitives from the Scythian lands, but would also hand over those who had already fled, together with the Roman prisoners of war who had come to their country without ransom, unless 8 gold coins were paid for each person who had been captured during the war. The Romans were obliged not to enter into an alliance with barbarians who fought against the Huns. Trade fairs had to be equal and safe for both the Romans and the Huns. To protect and continue the treaty, the Romans had to pay the royal Scythians 700 liters of gold each year, whereas previously it had been 350 liters. Under these conditions, the Romans concluded a treaty with the Huns, and after swearing an oath according to their native customs, the two sides returned to their respective territories. Those who had fled to the Romans were returned to the barbarians, including the children Mama and Attica, who were of royal descent. When the Scythians received them, they crucified them in the fortress of Carsus in Thrace as punishment for their escape. After the peace treaty was concluded, Attila bled a set about conquering the peoples of Scythia and started a war against the Saracens. The Scythians laid siege to the city of Nail. This Illyrian city was located on the Danube. It is said that this city was built by Constantine, who also built the city named after him in Byzantium. The barbarians wanted to capture this populous and fortified city and tried all means to do so. The defenders did not have the courage to go out into open battle, so the barbarians built a bridge on the south side of the river that flows around the city to facilitate the passage of their troops across it. They brought machines to the walls, first beams placed on wheels for easier movement. The people standing on them fired at the defenders who were fighting from the battlements, while other people on both sides of the beams pushed the wheels with their feet and directed the machines where they needed to be so that they could fire accurately from the openings formed in the coverings. Under Emperor Theodosius the Younger, the Hun king Attila gathered his army, sent a letter to the emperor regarding the fugitives and the tax that had not been handed over to him on the pretext that there was a war, and insisted that they be sent to him as quickly as possible and to send envoys to negotiate the amount of the future tax. He added that if the Romans delayed or prepared for war, even if he wanted to, he would not be able to stop the Scythian army. After reading this, the courtiers said that under no circumstances should they hand over those who had fled to them, and that they should even meet the attackers together with them. But they sent an embassy to them to resolve the contradictions. When Attila received the Romans' decision, he began to ravage the Roman lands in his anger, destroyed several fortresses, and proceeded to the large and populous Ratiaria, the village of Arcar, Vedan region. After the battle between the Romans and the Huns at Chersonesos, a treaty was concluded through the mediation of Anatolius on the following terms. The fugitives were to be handed over to the Huns, along with 6,000 liters of gold, according to the previous terms, and the annual tax was to be increased to 2,100 liters of gold. For every Roman captive who escaped to his land without ransom, 12 gold coins would be paid if those to whom he had escaped did not return the fugitive. The Romans must not accept any barbarians who have fled to them. The Romans pretended to sign this treaty voluntarily, but in fact they did what was necessary because of the fear that had seized their leaders. They wanted peace and were even willing to accept any harsh conditions, so they agreed to the heavy tax, which was very large for them, since their money and the royal treasures had been spent not for their intended purpose, but on pointless spectacles, reckless extravagance for pleasures, and unjustified expenses that no reasonable person, even a wealthy one, would incur, let alone people who had abandoned their weapons. Therefore, they had to pay taxes not only to the Scythians, but also to the other barbarians who were on their borders. In connection with all these conditions, because of the money they had to send to the Huns, they imposed a tax on everyone, even those who had been temporarily exempted from paying the heavy land tax by court decisions or because of the goodwill of the Basileus. It also became necessary for senators to contribute gold according to their high rank. For many, the glamorous life became the reason for a reversal of fortune. Because the tax collectors sent by the basileus collected by force what was determined for each person, and the previously wealthy people had to sell their wives' jewelry and their furniture on the market. After the war, such misfortunes befell the Romans that many who could not bear them ended their lives by hanging themselves. Then the treasury was completely emptied, and the fugitives were returned, and on this occasion Scotta arrived. So the Romans killed most of the captives who did not want to be handed over. Among them were royal Scythians who did not want to submit to Attila and had therefore fled to the Romans. Because of this, Attila increased his demands and ordered the Assamans to hand over whatever prisoners they had, whether Romans or barbarians. Assamus, at the mouth of the Osum River, was a strong fortress located within the borders of Thrace, not far from Illyria. There, the men who lived there inflicted great damage on their enemies, fighting outside the fortress moat against the advancing hordes and commanders, earning great fame among the Scythians. For this reason, the Huns retreated from this fortress, and the defenders pursued them and went far, when their scouts reported that enemies were passing by, carrying great Roman booty. They attacked them by surprise and took their booty, even though they were outnumbered by the enemies, but they surpassed them in virtue and strength. Thus, in this battle, the Assamans killed many Scythians and saved the Romans who had accepted the fugitives. Attila declared that he would not withdraw his army or confirm the peace treaty unless the Romans who had fled to them were handed over to him or a ransom was paid for them, and also unless the barbarians captured by the Assamans were released. Neither the ambassador Anatolius nor the commander of the army in Thrace, Theogelus, could contradict him. They neither persuaded him nor made reasonable proposals, and in his anger, the barbarian took up arms, while they were greatly disturbed by the events that had taken place so far. He sent letters to the Assamans demanding that they return the escaped Roman prisoners or pay 12 gold coins and release the captured Huns. Id Khan, a Scythian who had performed great military feats, arrived again as an ambassador, together with Orestes, who was of Roman descent and lived on the river Sava, in the land of the Paeonians, which was subject to him according to the treaty with General Aetius of the Western Romans. This Id Khan arrived at the palace to deliver letters from Attila, in which he accused the Romans of harboring fugitives. He threatened to seize their weapons if they were not handed over to him, and if the Romans did not give up cultivating the land he had conquered. This was the strip of land that stretched along the Danube from Pannonia to Novi in Thrace, 5 days' journey wide. He wanted the market in Illyria to be held not as before on the banks of the Danube, but in Nisus, which he had devastated, in a land that had become the border between the Scythians and the Romans, 5 days' journey from the Danube for a fast walker. He invited envoys to come to him to discuss the unresolved issues, but not just anyone, only the most authoritative among the consuls, if they were afraid that he would harm them by sending them. He said he would meet them in Sardinia. After the emperor had read these letters, Id Khan stepped forward with Vigila, who translated Attila's verbal requests, and then went to other buildings to introduce himself to the courtier Chrysaphius, a very influential man, and admired the royal palaces around him. When the barbarian began a conversation with Chrysaphius, Vigila translated that Id Khan was praising the palaces and admiring their riches. Chrysaphius said that he too could acquire a house with a golden roof and become a rich lord if he abandoned the Scythians and went over to the side of the Romans. When he replied that, as a servant of another master, he was not allowed to do such a thing without his permission, the eunuch asked him if he had unhindered access to Attila and some influence among the Scythians. He replied that he was Attila's confidant and that he and certain other people were entrusted with his security. Taking turns on certain days, each of them guarded Attila with weapons. Then the eunuch told him that if he gave his word of loyalty, he would tell him of a great favor. They needed to talk, and this could happen if he came to lunch without Orestes and the other envoys. He accepted this obligation and came to lunch with the eunuch, and with Vigila's translation, he swore an oath that the eunuch would make a good proposal to Id Khan, and that it would be for his own good, and that he would not reveal what would be said to him, even if it was not fulfilled. Then the eunuch told Id Khan that if he went to the Scythian land and killed Attila and returned to the Romans, he would receive a happy life and great wealth, promising him this and saying that he would need money for the deed, not much, but 50 liters of gold, to be given to his subordinates so that they would assist him without hesitation in the assassination. The eunuch promised to send him the gold in full in advance. The barbarian said that he must go and inform Attila of the embassy's mission and send Vigilius with him to receive Attila's decision regarding the fugitives. Then he would tell him how the gold should be sent, because when he returned, Attila would question both him and the others about the gifts and how much money they had been given by the Romans. And he would not be able to hide this from his companions. This seemed good to the eunuch, who accepted the barbarian's opinion and sent him away after lunch and went to report the plan to the Basilius. He sent for the Magister Maurizial and told him about the agreement with the barbarian. This was necessary because of his power. The Magister participated in all of the emperor's decisions, and the messengers, translators, and soldiers of the imperial guard were subordinate to him. After consulting on the matter, they decided to send not only Vigilius, but also Maximinus as ambassadors to Attila. In connection with the fact that Srasafi had persuaded Id Khan to kill Attila, at a meeting with the Basilius Theodosius and the Magister Martial, it was decided to send not only Vigilius, but also Maximinus on the mission to Attila. Vigila was to go under the guise of a translator and carry out what Id Khan had decided, while Maximinus, without being privy to their plan, was to deliver only the letters from the emperor. The letters stated that the men sent as envoys were Vigila, a translator, and Maximinus, who was older than Vigila, came from a noble family, was the emperor's most trusted man, and furthermore, that he must not violate the agreements and enter Roman territory. In addition to the fugitives I have already handed over to you, I am sending you 17 more because there are no others. This was what was written. And Maximinus was to tell Attila verbally that he should not demand that high-ranking envoys come to him. This was not the case with his ancestors or with other rulers of Scythia, but random soldiers or messengers were sent. And to smooth over the contradictions, he was going to send Onagesius to the Romans. It was not fitting for him to come and meet with some consul in the ruined city of Serdica. Maximinus persuaded me to accompany him on this diplomatic mission. So we set off together with the barbarians and arrived in Serdica, which was 13 days' fast march from Constantinople. Once we had settled comfortably there, we invited Id Khan and his barbarians to a feast. When the local people gave us sheep and cattle, we slaughtered them and prepared them skillfully. During the feast, the barbarians expressed their admiration for Attila, and we for the Basilius. But Vigilius said that it was not right to compare a god with a man, saying that Attila was a man and Theodosius a god. The Huns were outraged and, becoming a little heated, expressed their dissatisfaction. We redirected the conversation and prudently calmed their anger. And when we rose after the feast, Maximinus appeased Id Khan and Orestes with gifts, silk clothes, and Indian stones. Waiting for Id Khan to leave, Orestes told Maximin that he was a wise and good man for not acting like the people of the palace, who had invited Id Khan to the feast without him and honored him with gifts. Since these words seemed strange to the uninitiated, they asked when and how he had been neglected, while Id Khan had been honored, but he left without answering. The next day, on the road, we told Vigila what Orestes had said to us. Vigila replied that he should not be angry that he had not been honored like Id Khan, because he was only a servant and scribe to Attila, while Id Khan was an excellent warrior and, being of Hun descent, had risen much higher than Orestes. Having said this, he spoke privately with Id Khan, then came and told us whether he was playing a game or pretending. I could not say for sure that he had told him about our conversation, and I barely restrained myself, overcome with intense anger. When we arrived in Nisus, we found the city completely destroyed by the enemies, with the scattered bones of those killed in the war everywhere along the shores. The next day, we arrived at Agentes, in Illyria, which was not far from Nisus, to bring him the news from the fugitives because he had to hand over 5 of the 17 to us. We agreed that he would hand over the 5 fugitives to the Huns. He said a few friendly words to them and sent them with us. After spending the night in the vicinity of Nisus, we set off on the road to the river Ister, entering a shady valley with many twists and turns. At the place where we thought we were heading west in the morning, the sunrise appeared on the opposite side, so those unfamiliar with the place expressed surprise that the sun was moving in the opposite direction and that this was an unnatural phenomenon. But the road curved, and so this part of it faced east. After this difficult-to-pass place, we reached a wooded plain. From there, barbarians took us in dugout canoes, made from cut and hollowed-out trees, and carried us across the river. These canoes were not made for us, but for transporting the crowds of barbarians we met on our way, under the pretext that Attila wanted to use them to go hunting in Roman territory. In reality, this was preparation for war by the king of Scythia under the pretext that not all the fugitives had been handed over to him. After crossing the Ister and traveling about 70 stadia with the barbarians, we had to stop on a plain so that Edicon's men could inform Attila of our arrival. The barbarians who accompanied us stayed with us, and in the evening, while we were eating, we heard the sound of horses' hooves. 2 Scythians came and told us that we were invited by Attila. First, we invited them to share our meal. They dismounted from their horses and had dinner, and the next day, they led us on our way. Around the 9th hour of the day, we arrived at Attila's tents, which were numerous, and we asked to pitch ours on a hill. But the barbarians who were standing there stopped us because Attila's tent was in the low place. When we settled where the Scythians had directed us, Edcon, Orestes, Scotas, and other high-ranking officials came to us and asked what the purpose of our embassy was. While we looked at each other in confusion at their illogical question, they insisted on an answer. Finally, we said that we had been ordered by the Basileus to explain this to Attila, and not to anyone else, but an irritated Scotus replied that this was the will of their leader, otherwise they would not have come to us out of mere curiosity. Then they went to Attila, but soon returned without Edcon and told us everything we had been sent for, and then ordered us to leave as quickly as possible if we had nothing more to say. These words left us even more perplexed as to how they had learned of the secret decision made by the Basileus. Vigila did not know that he had already been betrayed by Edcon. The thing is that Edcon either made a false promise or was afraid that Orestes would harm him if he told Attila what he had told us in Serdica after dinner, that he alone, without him, had conducted negotiations with the king, and the eunuch had reported to him about the conspiracy against him and the amount of gold that had been set aside, and had concluded that this was the purpose of the embassy. While we were dealing with this, Attila invited us through Scotas, and we appeared before his tent, protected by a multitude of barbarians stationed around it. After we were invited to enter, we saw Attila sitting on a wooden throne. We stopped a little in front of the throne, and Maximinus, approaching the barbarians, handed him the letters from the Basileus and told him that the Basileus wished him and the people around him good health. And he wished them the same, which they wished him, and immediately turned to Vigilius, calling him a shameless animal, and asked him how he dared to appear before him, knowing his decision and that of Anatolius regarding peace, which included the condition that no envoys would appear before him until all the fugitives had been returned to the barbarians. He replied that there were no fugitives from the Scythian tribe among the Romans, because they had already been handed over to him. Attila became even more angry and showered him with curses and threatened to impale him and feed him to the eagles, if that would not be considered a violation of diplomatic practice, as punishment for the shamelessness and audacity of his words. He added that there were many fugitives from his tribe among the Romans and ordered his scribe to read out their names written on paper. When everything had been read out, he ordered him, Vigila, to leave immediately. When they reported his decision about the fugitives to the Basileus, the envoys were to return immediately with a decision as to whether the Romans wished to return them or whether they would choose war because of them. He told Maximinus to wait so that he could convey the reply to the letter from the Basileus through him and ask for the gifts. After we presented them, we returned to our tent and began to discuss his every word. Vigila was puzzled that while Attila had appeared moderate and calm during the previous embassy, he was now so rude. I said perhaps some of the barbarians who had participated in the feast with us in Serdica had contributed to Attila's mood when it was said that the Roman emperor was a god and Attila a man. Maximinus accepted this assumption as true, since he had not participated in the conspiracy that the eunuch had prepared against the barbarian. But Vigila remained doubtful, and it seemed to me that he did not give an answer as to why Attila had treated him so harshly. He did not think that Attila had been informed of his words spoken in Serdica, as he later told us, or of the conspiracy, because no one else among the bystanders dared to speak out against him for fear, and Ikon had to keep the secret because of its confidential nature, as well as because he had sworn an oath so that he himself would not be accused of participating in that conversation, of being a conspirator, and put in mortal danger. While we were in this confusion, Ikon suddenly came, took Vigil aside from our gathering, and pretending to speak the truth about the plan, asked for the gold to be brought that was to be distributed to the people who would go with him to carry out the task. And then he left. And when I was curious to know what Ikon had said, Vigila misled me. Though he himself was misled, hid the real reason, and said that Ikon himself had told him that Attila was angry with him because of the fugitives. Either he had to get them all, or else the most distinguished ambassadors would have to come to resolve the issue. While we were pondering what was happening, several of Attila's men appeared and told us that neither Vigila nor us were allowed to ransom a Roman captive, nor a slave from among the barbarians, nor a horse or anything else except food, until the dispute between the Romans and the Huns was resolved. This was done very wisely and skillfully by the barbarian, so that Vigila could easily be exposed for his hidden plan, as he could not explain why he was carrying gold, and we, in response to the purpose of our embassy, had to wait for Onagesius to receive the gifts that the emperor had sent and that we wanted to be presented by us. At the same time, he, together with Attila's eldest son, was sent to the tribe of the Akazirs, a Scythian people who had submitted to Attila for the following reason. This people had many chiefs by family name and clan, so Emperor Theodosius sent them a bribe to renounce their alliance with Attila by common consent and enter into a military alliance with the Romans. But the ambassador did not distribute the gifts according to their royal rank, so that the most powerful leader, Kiridak, received gifts second, and thus offended and deprived of the gifts intended for him. He called Attila against his co-rulers. Without delay, he sent a large army and, after destroying some and subjugating others, invited Curidas to celebrate the victory. But Curidas suspected that it was wrong for a man to appear before the face of a god. Just as one should not look carelessly at the sun, can one look with impunity at the greatest of the gods? Thus, Kiridak remained in his homeland and retained his power, while the entire Akaji people submitted to Attila. Wishing to make his eldest son king of this people, he sent Onagesius on this mission. Therefore, as was said, we were told to wait, and Vigila was sent to the Roman country with Isla to deal with the fugitives. But in fact, it was Ikon who received the gold. After Vigila set off, we stayed in the same place for a day after his departure, and the next day, we set off with Attila to the northern regions of the country. We traveled some distance with the barbarian, and then, guided by our Scythians, we took another road because Attila had to visit a village where he wanted to take Eskim's daughter as his wife, even though he had many wives, but according to Scythian custom, he wanted to take this one too. From there, we continued along a flat road, encountering navigable rivers, the largest after the Ister, called the Dryken, Tigas, and Tephesus. We crossed these in dugout canoes, which were available to the inhabitants along the river. We crossed the other rivers on rafts, which the barbarians used in their carts because of the marshy terrain. In the villages, they gave us food, millet instead of wheat, and instead of wine, the so-called mead. The servants who accompanied us received millet and a drink made from barley, which the barbarians called kamos. After traveling a long way, we settled down in the evening by a lake whose water was drinkable and used by the inhabitants of the nearby village. Suddenly, a storm broke out with wind, frequent thunder, and torrential rain, which not only destroyed our tent, but also swept all our belongings into the lake. Frightened by the raging storm and everything that had happened, we fled from that place, each taking his own escape route, and lost ourselves in the darkness. When we arrived at the village huts, it turned out that we had all been walking in the same direction but on different paths, so we gathered in one place and shouted for the others who had gotten lost. The Scythians jumped out of their huts, raised a commotion, lit torches to illuminate the area, and asked why we were shouting. When the barbarians who were with us replied that we had been scattered by the cold storm, they invited us to join them, showed us hospitality, and warmed us by lighting more reeds. The woman who ruled the village, who turned out to be one of Bledis' wives, sent us food and beautiful women for company, as a sign of respect from the Scythians. We invited them to the table provided for us, but we did not allow ourselves to talk any further, and so we spent the night in the huts. When day broke, we looked for our tents and found all our belongings, some where we had left them, others on the shore and in the waters of the lake, so we gathered them up. We spent that day in the village, drying everything, as the storm had passed and the sun was shining brightly. After saddling our horses and all the other pack animals, we presented ourselves to the queen and, warmly welcomed by her, offered her gifts: 3 silver cups, redskins, Indian feathers, dates, and other delicacies that are highly prized by barbarians because they are unfamiliar to them. We thanked her for her hospitality, wished her happiness, and departed. After traveling for 7 days, we stopped in a village on the orders of the Scythians who were accompanying us, because Attila was expected to pass by, and we had to follow him. Here we met people from Western Rome who were acting as Attila's envoys. One was Romulos, appointed comitatus and governor of the Noric province of Promut, and the other was Roman, commander of the military unit. They were accompanied by Constantine, sent by Aetius as secretary to Attila, and Tattle, father of Orestes, companion of Econ. The latter two traveled for personal reasons together with the officials outside the delegation, Constantine because of his close acquaintance with these persons, and Tattle because of kinship, since his son Orestes was married to Romulus' daughter. They came from Padavin, a city in Naricum. They followed the barbarian, waiting for him to give them an answer and send them away. When we found ourselves on the same road, we waited for him to pass in front of us and followed him together with the whole crowd of his companions. We crossed several rivers and found ourselves in a large settlement. As we were told, they were the most famous of all Attila's palaces, built of smooth trees and planks, surrounded by a wooden wall, which served not for security, but as decoration. After the king's palaces in splendor came the home of Onagesius, which was also surrounded by a wooden fence, but it was not decorated like Attila's with towers. Not far from his fence was the bathhouse built by Onagesius, who was influential among the Scythians after Attila. He brought the stones for its construction from the land of the Paeonians, because the barbarians inhabiting this area had neither stone nor wood, but used similar materials from other places. The architect of the bath was a slave brought from Sirmium, who expected his freedom as payment for his work, but fell into greater misfortune than being a slave among the Scythians. For Onagesius left him in the bath to serve him and his close friends when they bathed. Upon entering the village, Attila was greeted by maidens who approached in rows under thin white cloth stretched out over a long distance, so that under each cloth stretched by women's hands stood 7 or more maidens. There were many such rows of women lined up under the cloths, and they sang Scythian songs. When Attila arrived at the house of Onagesius, in front of which passed the road to the king's palaces, he was greeted by Onagesius' wife, followed by a multitude of maidservants, some of whom carried dishes and others wine, which was considered the highest form of respect among the Scythians. She greeted him and respectfully asked him to accept the treats she had brought. Delighted by the wife of his beloved, sitting on his horse, he agreed to taste the food that filled the bowl that the barbarians around him raised to him. It was made of silver. After tasting the cup offered to him, he headed for the palaces that towered above everyone, erected on a high place. While waiting for Onagesius, Romulus, Promut, and Roman, who had come from Italy as envoys to Attila regarding the golden files, in the presence of the companions of Constantius and Constantius, who is a resident of Paeonia, a country subject to Attila, began a conversation and asked if we were free or forced to wait. I said that I was standing in front of Onagesius' fence precisely to ask him this, and then I asked in turn whether Attila had responded positively and amicably to the task of their embassy. They replied that he had not changed his mind in the slightest and would declare war if Silvanus or the cups were not sent to him. While we marveled at the barbarians' madness, the envoy Rommel, a wise man and experienced in many things, spoke up and said that Attila's great fortune and the happiness that came from his power had led him to such arrogance that he could not bear truthful words if they were not to his advantage. Never before had any of the previous rulers of Scythia or other countries on earth been able to accomplish so much in such a short time. Starting from the islands of the ocean, all of Scythia, and even the Romans paying him tribute. In his desire to acquire more power than he already possessed, he intended to march against Persia. When asked by one of our people how he could reach Persia, Rommel replied that Media was not far from Scythia, and that this route was not unknown to the Huns, who had attacked it in ancient times when their country was ravaged by famine and the Romans did not intervene because of another war. Then the Basich and the Kursich, men of the royal Scythians, invaded Media, leading large hordes of people, and later stayed in Rome to conclude an alliance. Travelers at that time said that they passed through a deserted country, passed through a lake, which according to Rommel was the Meotian, traveling for 15 days and passing through a mountain, entering Media. While they were plundering this land, the hordes of Persians came out against them and filled the sky above them with arrows, so that because of the impending danger, the Huns retreated, crossing the mountains with little loot remaining. Most of it was taken by the Medes. Fearing persecution, they took another route along the rock that spewed flames, and after traveling for days, they returned home. In this way, they discovered that Media was not far from Scythia. So if Attila wishes to march against it, he will not have to struggle much and will not have to travel far to conquer the Medes, the Parthians, and the Persians and force them to pay him tribute. For he possesses such a mighty army that no people can withstand it. When we shared that he could march against the Persians and start a war against them, Constantius expressed his fears that he might easily conquer the Persians and return as an enemy instead of friend. Now they bring him gold, commensurate with his high rank. And if he subjugates the Parthians, the Medes, and the Persians, he will no longer tolerate the Romans appropriating his power for themselves, but will unceremoniously place them under his rule and impose the heaviest demands on them. The title mentioned by Constantius was Commander of the Romans, for which Attila is entitled to the necessary taxes from the emperor, worthy of his high name, and they will be given to him in the form of maintenance due to a commander of this rank. He also said that after conquering the Medes, the Parthians, and the Persians, Attila would abandon the name by which the Romans preferred to call him, which they considered quite respectful, and would call himself king instead of commander. Before long, his power would grow even greater. A sign of this was given by God himself with the discovery of the sword of Ares, which was sacred and greatly revered by the kings of the Scythians as the Lord of War, lost in ancient times and now found by an ox. Then I returned to Onagesius, and told him that the Romans would like him to come to them to negotiate the misunderstandings that had arisen. But if that did not happen, then we would send to the king whichever of the ambassadors he wished. He asked me to quickly summon Maximinus, and as soon as he arrived, he took him to Attila. Shortly thereafter, Maximinus came out and said that the barbarian wished to negotiate with Nam, or with Anatolius, or with Senator. He would accept no one else. In response to the fact that it was not good to invite people from the embassy, as they might appear suspicious to the king, Attila stated that if they did not agree to carry out his will, he would resolve the disputed issues with weapons. When we returned to our tent, Orestes' father came and said that he was inviting us both to a feast, which would begin at the 9th hour of the day. At the appointed hour, we appeared at the banquet together with the ambassadors of the Western Romans and stood on the path in front of Attila. And cupbearers brought us cups according to their custom before we sat down. After we did so, we drank from the cups and sat down on the chairs that had been assigned to us for eating. There were chairs lined up along the walls of the room on both sides. Attila sat on a couch in the middle, and behind him was another bed, for which a few steps led to his bedroom, covered with linen and colorful curtains as decoration, as the Greeks and Romans do for newlyweds. Those who sat to the right of Attila were considered the most important, and those to the left, where we were second in importance, with Barich, a nobleman, sitting above us. Onagesius sat on a chair to the right of the king's bed. Opposite Onagesius, Attila's 2 children sat on chairs. The eldest sat on his bed, but not next to him, but at the end, looking at the ground out of respect for his father. When the entire audience was seated, the cupbearer came and presented Attila with a cup of wine. As he took it, he greeted the first in line. The honoree stood up in a sign of respect and did not sit down until Attila had taken a sip or drunk the wine from the cup and given it back to the cupbearer. All those present paid their respects to the seated person by taking the cup and making a toast. Each guest had a separate cupbearer, who was to enter only after Attila's cupbearer had left. After greeting the second and subsequent guests, when it was our turn, Attila honored us with a similar toast. After everyone had been honored with a toast, the cupbearers left, and after Attila's table, tables were set for every 3 or 4 or even more guests, so that everyone could take a dish of food without leaving their seat. Attila's servant entered first, carrying a platter full of meat, followed by the servants of the guests, who brought bread and appetizers. For the other barbarians, and for us, a wide variety of delicacies were prepared, arranged on round silver platters, while Attila was served only meat on a wooden plate. In this, and in everything else, he showed moderation. For example, while the guests were served gold and silver cups, his drink was in a wooden one. He was also modest in his clothes and did not stand out from the others, except in their cleanliness. Neither his sword hanging at his side, nor the laces of his barbarian boots, nor the bridle of his horse shone with gold, stones, or other precious things, as they did among the other Scythians. When the first courses had been eaten, we all stood up, and no one sat down until each guest in the first row had drunk the full cup of wine presented to him and wished Attila good health. After we had honored him in this way, we sat down, and a second course with other dishes was served at each table. After we had all eaten these dishes, we stood up again in the same way, drank, and sat down again. As evening fell, torches were lit, and 2 barbarians stood before Attila and sang prepared songs praising his victories in battle and his exploits. Those present at the feast watched them, some admiring the songs, others remembering their wars and lifting their spirits, and those whose physical strength had weakened and whose times and spirits were already leading them to tranquility shed tears. Attila remained motionless, his face unchanged, and did not reveal his good mood with a single word or gesture, except when his youngest child, named Ernest, came in and stood next to him, and he pinched his cheek and looked at him affectionately. When I expressed my surprise that he did not pay much attention to the other children, but treated this one kindly, the barbarian standing next to me, with whom I communicated in Aesopian, Latin, warned me not to reveal his words to anyone and explained that Attila had been told by fortune tellers that his family would fall, but that this child would raise it up again. And while the guests continued their revelry throughout the night, we slipped away, not wanting to linger long in the drunken revelry. When day broke, we appeared before Onagesius and said that we did not want to waste any more time and that it was right to let us go. He said that Attila also wanted to send us away. Shortly thereafter, he held a meeting with selected people regarding Attila's motives, as well as to compose a letter to the emperor in the presence of Rusticius, a resident of Upper Moesia, captured in the war and, thanks to his education, taken to serve the barbarian in writing letters. When he came out of their meeting, we turned to him with a request for the release of Scylla and her child, taken into slavery during the capture of Ratiaria. He did not refuse their release, but demanded a large ransom. We began to beg him to have mercy on their fate, considering their happy life before, and he went to Attila, who agreed to give the woman for 500 pieces of gold, and the child as a gift to the Basilius. At that time, Rika, or Krika, Attila's wife, invited us to have lunch with Adam, her secretary. We went to him with several of his compatriots and were welcomed hospitably. He welcomed us with kind words and prepared feasts. And each of the Scythians present, according to their custom, handed us a full cup, and then, as we embraced and kissed the drinker, he took the cup back. After lunch, we returned to the large tent and lay down to sleep. The next day, Attila invited us to feast again, and we went to him in the same way and began a feast. This time, none of his older children sat on the couch next to him, but Obers, his uncle on his father's side. During the feast, he spoke to us in friendly words and asked us to tell the Basilius that he had given Constantius, who had been sent to him by Aetius as a secretary, the woman he had promised. The point is that Constantius, who had come to Emperor Theodosius together with Attila's envoys, promised to conclude an unbreakable peace between the Romans and the Scythians if he gave him a rich woman. After we left the banquet, 3 days after that night, we were released with fine gifts. Barich, who sat above us at the banquet, a man of authority, leader of many villages in Scythia, was sent with us as an ambassador to the Basilius, and he, as an ambassador, was to receive gifts from the Romans. When we stopped near a village, a Scythian was captured, who had crossed from Roman to Scythian territory as a field scout. Attila ordered him to be impaled. The next day, passing through other villages, we saw 2 Scythian slaves with their hands tied behind their backs, who had killed their masters during the war. They were stretched out on a cross, with their heads tied to the posts. While we were traveling through Scythia, Barich, who was walking with us on the road, seemed calm and courteous. But as soon as we crossed the Ister, he began to treat us with hostility because of some foolish talk from his servants. First, he took the horse from Maximinus, who had given it to him as a gift. The explanation is that Attila had told all his people to give Maximinus gifts of friendship, and everyone had given him a horse, including Barich. After accepting several horses, he returned the rest to appear courteous. He took this particular horse and refused to ride with us or eat with us. Thus ended the agreement made on barbarian soil. We then passed through the city of Philippi on our way to Adrianople. When we stopped to rest, we spoke to Barich and reproached him for his silence, without having any fault in this. After assuring him of this and inviting him to eat, we set off again. On the way, we met Vigilius, who was returning to Scythia, and after informing him of Attila's response to our visit, we continued on our way back. When we arrived in Constantinople, we thought that Barich had replaced his anger with gentleness. But he had retained his fierce temper and continued to behave hostile, accusing Maximinus of saying, while in Scythia, that the generals Areavind and Aspar were of no importance to the king and treating them with contempt, emphasizing their barbaric stupidity. When Vigila, walking and approaching the places where Attila happened to be at that time, was surrounded by barbarians prepared for this and took the money he had intended for Econ. They took him before Attila, who asked him why he was carrying so much gold. He replied that he had taken it for the sustenance of himself and his companions, so as not to fail in his mission due to a lack of provisions and horses or the necessary draft animals to carry the baggage, which could perish during the long journey. In addition, he had prepared it for the ransom of captives, as there were many requests from the Romans to ransom their relatives. At this, Attila shouted at Vigilius, "No, you filthy animal, you will not escape justice with your fabrications, and you will not have enough excuses to escape punishment, because you have more money than you need to buy horses, draft animals, and to ransom captives, which I refused you when you came with Maximinus." Having said this, he ordered that Vigilius' son, who had accompanied him for the first time to the barbarian land, be beheaded with a sword if he did not confess by then for whom and for what purpose he was carrying the money. At the sight of his child being led to his death, bathed in tears and cries, he shouted that he should be punished with the sword, not his child, who was completely innocent. And without delay, he told them what he had planned with Khan, the eunuch, and the Basilius, while constantly begging them to kill him and release the child. Attila, knowing everything from Khan and seeing that Vigila was not lying, threw him in chains and threatened that he would not release him until he sent his son to bring him another 50 liters of gold as ransom. Thus, he was imprisoned until the boy returned to Roman territory. Attila also sent Orestes and Islas to Constantinople. Although Attila was by nature always quick to anger, he gained even greater self-confidence because of the discovery of the sword of Mars, Ares, the god of war, which was always considered sacred by the Scythian kings. The historian Priscus writes that it was found in the following way. A shepherd, seeing that one of his cows was limping and not knowing the reason for it, followed the bloody tracks to find out the cause. Finally, he came to the sword, which the grazing cow had accidentally stepped on. After digging up the sword, he immediately took it to Attila. Delighted with this gift, and being a maximalist, he considered himself the ruler of the world, and that through the sword of Mars he had been given victory in all wars. Since the Scythian Balemer had broken the treaty and ravaged many Roman cities and regions, the Romans sent envoys to him, who reproached him for his new actions and, in order to prevent him from attacking them again, agreed to give him 300 liters, gold coins, every year. His explanation was that his people had gone to war because of the poverty that had befallen them. At the same time, the Saragers, Urogs, and Onagers sent an embassy to the eastern Milmans, peoples forced to leave their homes because of an attack by the Savars, who had been driven out by the Avars, who had become immigrants because of peoples living near the ocean, who had left their lands because of fogs coming from the ocean tide, because of the flu. They had a prophecy that they would not stop until they had turned the human race into food. Therefore, driven by these disasters, they attacked their neighbors. And since the attackers were stronger, the others, unable to withstand the pressure, were forced to emigrate. Thus, the Saragers, retreating and seeking lands to live on, reached the Huns' Akagiri and, after many battles with them, subjugated them and appeared before the Romans with a desire to become their friends. The emperor and his close associates welcomed them hospitably and, after giving them gifts, sent them back. Since the Sciri and the Goths went to war for 66 and opposed each other, both sides set out to find allies. So they came to the Easterners, Romans. Aspar expressed the opinion that they should not help either side, but Emperor Leo wanted to help the Syrians. He wrote a letter to the Illyrian military commander recommending that he send the necessary aid against the Goths. At that time, Attila's embassy was sent to Emperor Leo, undertaking to explain the reasons for the earlier differences and the need to conclude a truce, according to the ancient custom of meeting at the Ister with the Romans, who would deliver their goods for sale and make an exchange, whatever happened. The embassy that arrived for this purpose returned without success. The ruler did not want the Huns, who had caused so much harm in his lands, to participate in such deals according to Roman rules. Attila's sons, having received this response from the embassy, quarreled, Because the embassy returned without results, Dingizic demanded that they start a war against the Romans, but Ernak refused to prepare for it, as he was fighting local wars. When Dingizic marched to war against the Romans and stopped on the banks of the Ister, this was noticed by the son of Arnagistol, Anagast, who was guarding the river from the Thracian shore. He sent his men to find out why they were preparing for battle. Dingizic treated Anagast mockingly, sending his men back empty-handed and ordering them to tell the Basilius that if he did not give him land and money for himself and his army behind him, he would start a war. When his envoys returned to the palace and conveyed his message, the Basilius replied that he was ready to do anything if they came to him with humility. He would be glad if his enemies came to conclude an alliance.